The air in our village always smelled of earth and salt, a mix of the fertile land and the distant sea that seemed to call out to me since I was a child. Our small farm was tucked away in the shadow of the mountains, far from the bustling towns and cities, and even farther from the world I dreamed of. My father worked the fields with the strength of a man who had known nothing else, while my mother tended to the chickens and the small garden where we grew our vegetables. Life was simple, but it was also harsh, especially for someone like me, a boy who carried the burden of a heritage that made me an outsider among my own people. My father's family was Filipino, but my mother's blood was Japanese. It was a mix that made life difficult for me in the village. Even though the war had ended years before I was born, the memories of the Japanese occupation still lingered in the hearts of the older generation. They would look at me with eyes full of distrust, as if the sins of my mother's people had been passed down to me. The whispers followed me everywhere I went, reminders that I was different, that I didn't fully belong. It was this feeling of not belonging that pushed me to dream beyond the mountains, beyond the sea. I would lie awake at night, staring at the wooden beams above my bed, imagining a life where I could prove myself, where I could be something more than just a poor farm boy. My chance came when I heard about the U.S. Navy recruiting in Subic Bay. They were offering good money and the promise of a new life, a chance to escape the poverty that had always defined us. I knew it was my only way out, my only chance to make something of myself and help my family. Leaving the farm was one of the hardest things I ever did. My father's silence the morning I left spoke louder than any words could. He didn't want me to go, but he knew, just as I did, that there was no future for me in the village. My mother, with tears in her eyes, pressed a small wooden charm into my hand, a token of good luck that I would carry with me everywhere. As I walked away from the only home I had ever known, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. The world was opening up to me, but it was also a world that I knew nothing about. The journey to Subic Bay was long and grueling. I traveled by foot and by bus, through towns and cities that were as foreign to me as the language of the American soldiers I would soon meet. When I finally arrived at the naval base, I was overwhelmed by the chaos and the noise. The base was a sprawling complex of barracks, warehouses, and docks, filled with sailors from all over the world. It was a place of contrasts, where the disciplined order of military life clashed with the wild nightlife of bars and brothels that lined the streets just outside the gates. My first days at the base were a blur of paperwork, medical exams, and tests. They poked and prodded us, measuring our strength, our endurance, our intelligence. I was determined to pass, to prove that I was just as good as any of the other recruits, but the tests were harder than I had imagined. I watched as men were turned away, their dreams crushed in an instant. There were moments when I thought I might be next, that I might be sent back to the village as a failure. But I pushed through, driven by the thought of my family, by the need to prove myself. It was during this time that I met Roberto Santos. He was a little older than me, maybe 29, with a quiet determination that I admired. Roberto wasn't just there for himself. He had a sick son back home who needed the medical benefits the Navy offered. We shared stories during the long waits between tests, and his calm, steady presence helped me keep my nerves in check. We were both there to escape something, but we were also there to fight for something. Me for my future, and him for his son's life. When I finally passed the tests and was accepted into the Navy, I felt a surge of relief and pride. I had done it. I had taken the first step towards a new life. But the relief was short-lived. Just as I was beginning to settle in, I was told that there had been a mistake in my paperwork, something that could have disqualified me from enlisting. For a moment, it felt like everything was slipping away, like all my efforts had been for nothing. But after what felt like an eternity, the issue was resolved, and I was cleared to continue. It was a close call, and it reminded me of how fragile my new life really was. The day I boarded the U.S. America, I felt a mix of emotions that I still find hard to describe. The ship was massive, a floating city that seemed to stretch on forever. I was assigned to work in the officers' mess hall, a place where the hierarchy of the Navy was on full display. The officers were the kings of this floating kingdom, and men like me were there to serve them. It was a hard reality to accept, but I knew that I had to start somewhere. This was my chance, and I wasn't going to let anything stand in my way. As the ship set sail, I stood on the deck and watched as the coastline of the Philippines disappeared into the horizon. I thought of my family, of the village I had left behind, and of the new life that awaited me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own destiny. I didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but I was ready to face them, whatever they might be. The U.S. America was like nothing I had ever imagined. A steel fortress afloat on the endless ocean, it was a city unto itself, with its own rules, rhythms, and of course, a hierarchy that I quickly learned to navigate. My first days aboard were a blur of instructions and introductions, as I was assigned to work in the officers' mess hall. It wasn't the glamorous life I had dreamed of when I imagined joining the Navy, but it was a start, a foothold in a world that was still strange and overwhelming to me. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Wilson was my immediate supervisor, and I knew from the moment I met him that he was someone to respect. He was a big man, built like a mountain, with a deep voice that carried authority. But there was a kindness in his eyes, a kind of understanding that put me at ease. He knew the challenges that sailors like me faced, the ones who didn't quite fit the mold of the typical American sailor. He was well liked by the Filipino sailors, and I quickly understood why. He didn't just see us as bodies to fill positions. He saw us as people, each with our own story. The mess hall was a place of order and precision, where the officers came to eat and unwind after their shifts. My job was simple enough: serve the food, keep the place clean, and stay out of the officers' way. But it was in this seemingly simple role that I began to see the unspoken divisions that ran through the ship. The officers were the elite, the decision-makers, while the rest of us, especially those of us who were not white, were expected to keep our heads down and do our jobs without complaint. It was a hierarchy as rigid as the steel walls of the ship itself. It wasn't long before I had my first run-in with Lieutenant David Harrison. He was a fighter pilot, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. To him, I was invisible, just another faceless sailor whose sole purpose was to make his life more comfortable. One morning, as I was serving coffee, my hand slipped, and a few drops spilled onto the table. It was a small mistake, something that could have easily been overlooked, but Harrison made sure it wasn't. He looked at me with cold eyes and a sneer on his lips, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks as he berated me in front of the other officers. His words cut deep, not because of what he said, but because of what they meant. To him, I was nothing, a nameless, faceless servant who didn't deserve his respect. I wanted to say something, to defend myself, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was stand there, humiliated, as he continued to tear me down. Chief Wilson intervened before things could get worse. He stepped in between us, his large frame a barrier that Harrison couldn't easily push through. With a calm but firm tone, Wilson diffused the situation, telling Harrison that it was just a mistake, nothing more. Harrison scowled but eventually backed down, muttering something under his breath as he returned to his meal. I could feel the other sailors' eyes on me as I cleaned up the mess, my hands trembling with a mix of anger and shame. That night, I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying the incident over and over in my mind. The humiliation, the anger, the sense of powerlessness, they all swirled together, keeping me awake long after the others had fallen asleep. I had left the village to prove myself, to be something more than the poor farm boy with the tainted heritage. But here I was, being reminded once again that I was different, that I didn't belong. The next morning, Captain Richard Fowler called me to his office. I had never met the captain before, but I had heard stories. He was a stern man, with a reputation for being short-tempered and strict. As I stood at attention in front of his desk, I could feel his eyes boring into me, assessing me, judging me. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me he had heard about the incident with Lieutenant Harrison, and he wasn't pleased. To him, it didn't matter who was at fault. What mattered was that there had been a disturbance, and that was unacceptable. As punishment, Captain Fowler decided to reassign me. He told me I would be leaving the U.S. America to join the Brown Water Navy in the Mekong Delta. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The Delta was a place of nightmares, where the war was fought up close and personal, in the narrow rivers and dense jungles of Vietnam. It was a far cry from the relative safety of the aircraft carrier, and I knew that being sent there was more than just a punishment. It was a sentence. Chief Wilson tried to intervene on my behalf, but Captain Fowler was firm. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. I packed my things in silence, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. The other sailors offered words of encouragement, but they rang hollow in my ears. I was leaving the ship, leaving the life I had just begun to understand, and heading into the unknown. The fear was almost overwhelming. But beneath it all, there was something else, a burning determination to survive, to prove that I was more than what others thought of me. The flight to the Mekong Delta was long and quiet. I stared out the window, watching as the blue of the ocean gave way to the green of the jungle, the dense, impenetrable landscape that would soon become my new home. When we landed, the heat hit me like a wall, thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. I was met by a group of men who would be my new crew, and I could see the wariness in their eyes, the kind that comes from seeing too much, knowing too much. Carlos Ramirez was the first to introduce himself. He was the petty officer in charge of the PBR, a cautious man with a sharp mind and a steady hand. He didn't say much, but his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This was a man who had seen things, done things, and survived. He welcomed me aboard with a nod and a few words of advice. Stay alert, stay quiet, and follow orders. James Walker, the engine man, was next. He was a bit younger than Ramirez, with a warmth to him that put me at ease. He showed me around the boat, explaining the systems, the weapons, the protocols. There was a seriousness to him, a sense of responsibility that I hadn't seen in many others. He took his job seriously, and I knew I would need to do the same if I wanted to survive. Finally, there was Thomas Whitman, the gunner. He was a wiry man, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was skeptical of me at first, and I could tell he wasn't sure if I would be able to handle the pressures of life in the Delta. But he was willing to give me a chance, and that was all I could ask for. As the sun set over the jungle, casting long shadows over the river, I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. The U.S. America was far behind me now, and ahead lay a new world, one where the rules were different, where survival was not guaranteed. I didn't know what awaited me in the Delta, but I was determined to face it head-on, to prove that I was more than just a poor farm boy, more than just a sailor. I was ready to become a warrior. The Mekong Delta was nothing like I had imagined. It was a world of its own, where the lines between the living and the dead seemed to blur with each passing day. The jungle was thick and unforgiving, the heat oppressive, and the river, our lifeline, was a murky, winding path through a landscape that felt more like a living creature than just land and water. From the moment I set foot in that place, I felt a sense of unease settle into my bones, as if the Delta itself was watching, waiting for the right moment to swallow us whole. Our missions were tense, silent affairs, navigating the narrow waterways where danger lurked behind every bend. The Viet Cong were masters of the terrain, using the jungle to their advantage, and we had to stay sharp, ready to respond to an attack at any moment. The men on the PBR were seasoned, their movements precise and practiced, but I was still finding my footing, trying to adjust to the constant tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. It wasn't long before the whispers started. The dead zone, they called it, a place deeper in the Delta where even the Viet Cong feared to tread. The stories varied from man to man, each tale more terrifying than the last. Some said it was haunted by the ghosts of the soldiers who had died there, their restless spirits seeking revenge on the living. Others spoke of a curse that had been placed on the land, a curse that drove men mad and turned the jungle itself against them. I tried to push the stories aside, telling myself they were just that, stories. But there was something in the eyes of the men who spoke them, something that told me they believed every word. Our orders came in late one evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting the delta in a blood-red light. A pilot had gone down in the dead zone, and it was our job to get him out. The name of the pilot hit me like a punch to the gut. Lieutenant David Harrison. The same man who had humiliated me on the U.S. America. The same man who had looked down on me as if I were nothing. Now he was the one in need of saving, and it was my duty to go after him. The irony wasn't lost on me as we prepared to head into the dead zone. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let Harrison fend for himself, but the Navy had drilled a sense of duty into me that I couldn't shake. This was the job, and I was going to do it, no matter how much I resented the man we were risking our lives for. As we set off, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving us in darkness, the only light coming from the dim glow of our boat's instruments. The further we traveled into the dead zone, the thicker the air became, heavy with the scent of decay, and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning over the river as if trying to keep us out. The water grew darker, almost black, and the sounds of the jungle grew quieter, as if even the animals knew to stay away from this place. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands slick with sweat as I gripped my weapon, scanning the banks for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of gunfire. It came from ahead, near where the pilot's signal had last been detected. Ramirez barked orders, and the boat surged forward, the engine straining against the current. We returned fire as best we could, but the enemy was hidden, using the jungle as cover. My pulse raced as bullets whizzed past, some finding their mark in the hull of the boat, others zipping harmlessly into the water. I felt the fear rising in my throat, but I forced it down, focusing on the task at hand. There was no room for fear here, not if we wanted to survive. As we neared the source of the gunfire, the PBR lurched suddenly, as if something had grabbed hold of it. The men on board staggered, struggling to keep their balance. I looked over the side, my heart nearly stopping when I saw the massive coils rising from the water. It was a snake, but not like any snake I had ever seen. It was enormous, its body thick as a tree trunk, its scales glistening in the dim light. The creature was wrapped around the boat, its muscles rippling as it squeezed, the wood and metal groaning under the pressure. Panic set in as the crew scrambled to respond. Walker and Whitman fired at the snake, but the bullets seemed to do little more than anchor it. The snake's head rose from the water, its eyes locking onto us with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. It struck with lightning speed, its jaws snapping shut just inches from where I stood. The boat rocked violently, water splashing over the sides as the creature continued its assault. It was in that moment, with the giant snake threatening to drag us all to our deaths, that something inside me shifted. The fear was still there, but it was joined by something else, a fierce determination to survive. I grabbed the nearest weapon, a grenade launcher, and took aim at the snake's head. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I forced myself to steady, to focus. With a silent prayer, I pulled the trigger. The grenade exploded against the snake's skull, sending up a spray of blood and scales. The creature recoiled, its grip on the boat loosening. I didn't hesitate, firing again and again, each shot landing with deadly precision. The snake thrashed in the water, its massive body creating waves that rocked the boat violently. Finally, with one last shudder, it released us, its body sinking slowly beneath the dark water, leaving only ripples behind. The aftermath was a blur. My hands shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline began to wear off, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. We found Lieutenant Harrison, barely conscious and clinging to life, and pulled him aboard. He was wounded, but alive. As we turned the boat around and began the journey back, I couldn't help but glance back at the water, half expecting the snake to rise again. But the river was still, as if nothing had happened, as if the jungle had swallowed the beast whole and was now waiting patiently for its next victim. As we sailed out of the dead zone, the tension among the crew began to ease, though none of us spoke of what had just occurred. There was an unspoken understanding that this place, this cursed stretch of jungle and river, was beyond our comprehension. It was a place where the rules of the world we knew didn't apply, where monsters were real and survival was never guaranteed. We had faced death and lived, but the cost of that survival weighed heavily on us all. When we finally reached base, the relief was palpable. Harrison was taken away for medical treatment, and the rest of us were left to process what had happened. I knew that I had crossed a line that night, that I was no longer the same person who had arrived in the Mekong Delta just a few weeks before. The fear and anger that had driven me were still there, but they had been tempered by something stronger, a resolve to face whatever came next with the same determination that had saved us in the dead zone. As I lay in my bunk that night, the sounds of the jungle replaced by the hum of the base, I couldn't shake the image of the giant snake from my mind. It was a reminder that the world was full of dangers we couldn't always see, that survival was a constant battle against forces beyond our control. But it was also a reminder that I was stronger than I had ever realized, that I had the power to face those dangers and come out the other side alive. The Delta had tested me in ways I never could have imagined, but it had also revealed a strength I didn't know I possessed. As sleep finally took hold, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready for it. I had faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale, and that was something no one could take away from me. When we returned to the U.S. America, I felt like I was stepping into a different world. The familiar hum of the ship's engines, the clang of metal on metal, and the disciplined routine of life aboard felt almost alien after the raw, primal experience of the Mekong Delta. My body ached from the constant tension. My mind was weary from the images that still haunted me. But there was something else too, a quiet sense of accomplishment, a feeling that I had faced something unimaginable and come out the other side stronger. Word of what had happened in the dead zone spread quickly. Sailors I barely knew nodded at me with newfound respect as I walked the ship's corridors, and some even went out of their way to offer a handshake or a pat on the back. It was a strange sensation, being seen as a hero. I wasn't sure how to feel about it. Part of me wanted to reject the label, knowing how close we had come to dying out there, how much of what happened had been luck as much as courage. But another part of me, a part I had only recently discovered, was proud of what I had done. I had proven myself in the most terrifying of circumstances, and that was something no one could take away. Chief Petty Officer Wilson was waiting for me when I returned to the mess hall. He had heard the stories, of course, and his usual stern expression softened slightly as he looked at me. "You did good out there, Reyes," he said simply, and those few words meant more to me than any of the accolades I had received from others. Wilson wasn't a man to hand out praise lightly, and knowing that I had earned his respect was something I would carry with me for a long time. But even as I tried to settle back into the routine of shipboard life, something had changed. The mess hall, which had once been a place of order and predictability, now felt suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the endless clatter of dishes and silverware grated on my nerves. I found myself on edge, unable to shake the feeling that danger was lurking just out of sight, ready to strike at any moment. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of the giant snake, its cold, dead eyes staring back at me as it rose from the murky waters of the Delta. The nightmares weren't the only thing that followed me back from Vietnam. Not long after our return, I began to notice strange symptoms among the men who had served in the Delta. At first, it was just a few isolated cases, rashes that wouldn't go away, persistent coughs that defied treatment. But soon, more men started showing signs of illness, and the whispers about Agent Orange grew louder. We had all seen the planes spraying the chemical over the jungle, a toxic mist designed to strip the trees bare and expose the enemy. At the time, we hadn't thought much of it. It was just another tool in the arsenal, another way to fight the war. But now, it seemed the war was fighting back in ways we hadn't anticipated. I started experiencing symptoms too, headaches that wouldn't go away, a constant fatigue that weighed me down like a lead blanket. I tried to push through it, to keep up with my duties, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the toll it was taking on my body. The Navy doctors didn't have many answers, just vague reassurances that it was probably nothing serious, that I should get some rest and drink plenty of water. But I knew there was something more going on, something they weren't telling us. Lieutenant Harrison wasn't immune to the effects either. The man who had once been so arrogant and dismissive now moved with a noticeable limp, his face pale and drawn. We crossed paths one day in a narrow corridor, and for a moment, I saw the same fear in his eyes that I had felt so many times in the Delta. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me before continuing on his way. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The war had changed us both, and now we were facing a new battle, one that didn't involve guns or bombs, but was just as deadly. As the days turned into weeks, the reality of our situation became harder to ignore. The effects of Agent Orange were becoming more apparent, not just among the men who had served in the Delta, but across the entire fleet. The Navy tried to downplay it, to keep us focused on our duties, but the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing day. It was as if we had been marked by the jungle, cursed to carry its poison with us wherever we went. I started thinking more about my family back in the Philippines, about the life I had left behind. The money I sent home was still helping them, but what good was that if I wasn't around to see it? I had joined the Navy to escape the poverty and stigma of my heritage, to make something of myself, but now I was beginning to wonder if it had all been worth it. The war had taken so much from me already, my innocence, my peace of mind. And now it was threatening to take my health as well. One evening, as I sat alone on the deck, staring out at the vast expanse of ocean, I thought about the giant snake in the dead zone. In many ways, it was a fitting symbol for the war itself, an unknowable, monstrous force that could strike at any moment, leaving destruction in its wake. We had killed the snake, but the war was still very much alive, its poison seeping into our bodies, our minds, our souls. The true cost of what we had done, what we had been a part of, was still being calculated, and I wasn't sure if any of us would come out whole on the other side. In the end, all I could do was keep moving forward, one day at a time. The nightmares, the sickness, the memories, they were all part of me now, part of the man I had become. I had faced death and survived, but survival came with its own set of challenges, its own kind of pain. The war had left its mark on me, on all of us, and there was no going back to the way things were before. As the U.S. America sailed on through the endless blue, I knew that my journey was far from over. The war had taken me to places I had never imagined, shown me horrors I couldn't have dreamed of, and in many ways, it had made me who I was. But it had also taken something from me, something I wasn't sure I would ever get back. And yet, despite it all, I was still here, still fighting, still determined to find my way through the darkness. Because in the end, that was all any of us could do.